And thank you so much for watching Morning Live. Now, media outlets, Financial Mail and the AmaBhungane Centre for Investigative Journalism have approached the courts challenging current legislation that makes tax information secret. Now, this follows their application to the South African Revenue Service earlier this year to access former President Jacob Zuma's tax records. SARS dismissed their initial application, stating that the Promotion of Access to Information and Tax Administration Acts as its reason. Now, from Cape Town now, I'm joined by Karabo Rajuili, who's Advocacy Coordinator for AmaBhungane. Thanks so much for your time this morning and welcome to Morning Live, Karabo.
Morning, Sakina.
So, Karabo, let's start here. On what basis are you challenging the constitutionality of this current status with regard to SARS and tax information?
So, Sakina, you have set out correctly that earlier this year, the Financial Mail submitted a promotion of access to information request to get access to former President Zuma's tax records. Now, currently, they used PAIA, which is a Promotion of Access to Information Act, which gives right of access to all members of the public and the media. Now, as it stands right now, PAIA says that in instances where the tax information is related to a person, a taxpayer, that information is not publicly disclosable. So we're saying that this absolute secrecy, which both PAIA as well as the Tax Administration Act provides, even if the information is in the public interest, and we say that this information related to Zuma's tax compliance is in the public interest, and because we're not able to get this information, even though it should be in the public domain, we say that it's unconstitutional.
So it raises some very interesting questions, Karabo, because in as much as obtaining the former president's tax records is in the public interest, this would obviously have a greater bearing on accessing tax records of other people and a precedent that may be set. So what's your view in that regard?
So our application is very specific. We aren't simply saying that media or members of the public should be able to access information related to taxpayer information unreasonably. What we are saying is that should the person whose information that the media or the public is trying to access is from somebody who's of prominence, so somebody who's a prominent public figure like the president, that information should be disclosable. We also say that in instances where there's a public interest, so for example, if the disclosure of that information and publication would reveal some kind of corruption or contravention of the law, this information should be disclosable. And this is important because we know that SARS as an institution in the last 10 years has been one of the key institutions which was both captured and hollowed out. Now, had journalists been able to access that information or whistleblowers been able to freely say something is going profoundly wrong here, the kind of hollowing out of the institution which took place could have been halted. So we are saying that where the information may show some kind of wrongdoing, that information should be publicly disclosable. And this becomes a vital accountability and oversight tool that we have as a democracy.
So there have been sentiments expressed, some maintaining that SARS is protecting former President Jacob Zuma. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Our application doesn't deal with whether or not SARS is protecting or not protecting President Zuma. Our application deals specifically on whether we as journalists should have access to that information. And so I think the best people to give explanations about whether or not they are protecting Zuma would be SARS themselves. But we're saying the right to access information when it is in the public interest should not be about political whims or any other consideration. It should be a case of if there's a public interest, if it may hold any kind of corruption, if it may reveal wrongdoing, we should be able to get that information. But then just to clarify, our application is not simply for the Financial Mail and AmaBhungane to get that information. We say that the right of the public should be upheld in our application. So in other words, any person who's interested and may get this information to reveal wrongdoing should be able to access it. Obviously, journalists play a fundamental role in making information available to the public, but the application itself has got general applicability. So anybody, once this case goes to court, and if the court agrees with us, will be able to get this information.
So we saw in Jacques Pauw's book, The President's Keepers, some of the information, SARS information being made public there, and also former public protector Thuli Madonsela also, highlighting a few things. But why is it then important beyond what is already out there to access these records?
So Jacques Pauw, through his sources, was able to get a good amount of information, but he had to rely on sources, on whistleblowers. What the right that we want to entrench is that it shouldn't just be a case of always having to rely on sources or whistleblowers, but the information itself should be publicly disclosable. And this is important because even ourselves as AmaBhungane, when we're doing reporting on the restructuring of SARS under former Commissioner Tom Moyane and Makwak, when our journalists were revealing what was happening around the restructuring and pointing to say the restructuring is essentially the hollowing out of an institution, we were slapped with a defamation suit of 4 million rand. Now, this could only be seen as a tactic of intimidation for trying to disclose information about what was happening at SARS. And so what we are saying is that it's the ability of journalists to be able to get information and not be intimidated because the law doesn't sufficiently protect them should be challenged, and that should be changed. And so what we are saying is that the right of information needs to be clarified in the law so that the kinds of difficulties or potential intimidation which has taken place shouldn't become a chilling effect of other journalists or whistleblowers wanting to come and speak out about what's happening at crucial state institutions.
So this particular application, of course, relates to former President Jacob Zuma, but then going forward, when we talk about the parameters that will be established here, surely, looking at what's happening at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, for example, there are so many allegations being leveled against so many people. Would you then seek to also, if necessary, access tax records of people who may be mentioned and implicated there?
Precisely. So the application itself, so on the one hand, the application deals with the right to access former President Zuma's tax records. But then it also deals more broadly around if there's a public interest in getting information about other taxpayers who are prominent people or people holding high public office. We as journalists or members of the public should be able to also access that information. And that's important because we want to make sure that the full systemic nature of corruption which took place at SARS is fully exposed so that those who have done or committed the wrongdoings are held to account. So yes, if the law is changed and if the courts do agree with us, then there should be much wider access to implicated individuals who have information lodged at SARS.
But in the public interest, one would imagine, does not only apply to elected representatives and politicians and bureaucrats. That could extend to members of the public as well, because the state does do business with private entities.
Correct. And this is important because one of the features under state capture was the role of the enablers of state capture. So, for example, Bain, who had the contract to advise SARS on the restructuring, could be seen as an entity which may need to be further investigated. But I should say to perhaps assure the public that this is not an application which will simply throw the doors of all taxpayer information out into the public domain, is that a public interest, the test for public interest is a very narrow test, which says that there has to be some kind of evidence of wrongdoing or corruption. And so if you as a member of the public are submitting your tax to SARS, then you shouldn't be concerned that suddenly journalists or others are going to be unreasonably interested in the information. The right of privacy will still hold. We're simply saying that there should be an adequate balance between the right to privacy of taxpayer information against public interest when wrongdoing is occurring.
And just finally, Karabo, former President Zuma, he doesn't seem to have a problem with his tax records being scrutinized. He actually took to social media saying that if the current public protector, Busisiwe Mkhwebane, wants to obtain his SARS records, she must have them, and he has nothing to hide. What do you make of that in the context of this application that you are bringing?
So shortly after former President Zuma took to social media to say he's got nothing to hide, Warren from the Financial Mail made a request directly to former President Zuma to say, now that you have said that you've got nothing to hide, can we have access to that information since you're happy to disclose it? There was simply no response. And so the Financial Mail in good faith has approached President Zuma and has still not been able to get that information. So we simply have no other recourse but to take this to court.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning, Karabo Rajuili, who is Advocacy Coordinator for AmaBhungane Centre for Investigative Journalism, talking to us about their the Gauteng High Court case, which is, of course, a bid to access the tax returns of former President Jacob Zuma, and they are challenging the constitutionality of tax secrecy provisions, which is in the current legislation.